this hearing as the House is set to gavel back into session. Members about to start up to an hour of debate on extending certain USA Patriot Act provisions. Live on C-SPAN.
Sealed envelope received from the White House on February 14, 2011 at 2:35 p.m. and said to contain a message from the President whereby he submits his budget of the United States government for fiscal year 2012. With best wishes, I am, signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas, Clerk of the House.
The clerk will read the message.
To the Congress of the United States, America is emerging from the worst recession in generations. In 2010, an economy that has been shrinking began to grow again. After nearly 2 years of job losses, America's businesses added more than 1 million jobs. Our capital and credit markets are functioning and strong. Manufacturing is coming back, and after teetering on the brink of liquidation just 2 years ago, America's auto industry is posing healthy gains and returning money to the taxpayers who helped it through a period of turmoil. The determination and resilience of the American people and the tough choices we made over 2 years ago helped to pull our economy back from the brink of a second Great Depression. 2 years after those dark days, the stock market is booming. Corporations are posting record profits. Momentum is building. Yet in America, we have always had a broader measure of economic health. We believe in a country where everyone who is willing to work for it has the opportunity to get ahead, where the small business person with a dream or entrepreneur with a great new idea has their best chance to make them a reality, where any child can go as far as their talent and tenacity will take them. This is the genius of America. The spirit is what has built the greatest prosperity the world has ever known. I believe we must do what this moment demands and do what we must do to spur job creation and make the United States competitive in the world economy. For as difficult as the times may be, the good news is that we know what the future could look like for the United States. We can see it in the classrooms that are experimenting with groundbreaking reforms and giving children new math and science skills at an early age. We can see it in the wind farms and advanced battery factories that are opening across America. We can see it in the laboratories and research facilities all over this country that are churning out discoveries and turning them into new startups and new jobs. And when you meet with these children and their teachers, these scientists and technicians, and these entrepreneurs and their employees, you come away knowing that despite all we have been through these past 2 years, we will succeed. The idea of America is alive and well. As long as there are people willing to dream, willing to work hard, and willing to look past the disagreements of the moment to focus on the future we share, I have no doubt that this will be remembered as another American century. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House, February 14, 2011.
Referred to Committee on Appropriations and ordered printed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 79, I call up H.R. 514 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 514, a bill to extend expiring provisions of the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005 and Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, relating to access to business records, individual cherished as agents of foreign powers, and roving wiretaps until December 8, 2011.
Pursuant to House Resolution 79, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debated for 1 hour, with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on the Judiciary, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers, to control 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of these 3 provisions of the Patriot Act. I think it's very important that we extend them for a variety of reasons. The lone wolf provision, roving wiretaps, which have been in place for some time. We're not breaking any new ground here. Roving wiretaps have been used by local law enforcement for years in terms of dealing with drug dealers, organized crime. We're simply allowing those roving wiretaps to be extended to those who may be engaged with terrorist activities. Again, not new ground. Also importantly, that roving wiretap provision allows us to follow the person as opposed to the device. Because of the changing technologies, somebody can use a cell phone and pitch it and then pick up another one. So rather than having to run back to the court every time, it's much easier just simply to put get the warrant for that individual. Also, the business records provision is something that is extremely important, something that has often been the subject of a great deal of demagoguery, to be perfectly candid, where we have seen folks talk about this as a library provision. It should be noted that many of the 9/11 terrorists used public library or university library computers to make their plane reservations or to confirm those reservations. The whole point of the Patriot Act is to allow for sharing of information and intelligence between local law enforcement as well as our intelligence community. That's the point. We want to take down these terrorist cells and operations before they become operational. You know, many folks have said that we should not use our military to deal with terrorist threats, that this should be the function of local law enforcement. But many of those same people then will deny the very tools necessary to local law enforcement to take down these terrorist cells. That's why it's essential that we take the time today to reauthorize these three expiring provisions of the Patriot Act. It is the right thing to do. And one other thing I want to mention about lone wolf. These lone wolves are a real threat. And allowing us to continue to go after the lone wolf, even if they may not be part of a terrorist organization. We're usually talking about people who are not U.S. persons here. We need to make sure that our intelligence agencies, law enforcement, can go after those lone wolves. We've seen lone wolves, even though Major Hassan was a U.S. person. That's the type of person we are concerned about. We're going to see more of that at this time. I want to thank the Speaker for his consideration. I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to rise to address H.R. 514, a bill that would reauthorize three expiring provisions of the Patriot Act until December of this year, just 10 months from now. Like the administration, I would like to see a 3-year extension of these authorities until 2013, similar to a Senate Bill 289 currently pending in the Senate. This longer term would give our nation's intelligence and law enforcement agencies the predictability and certainty they need to keep our country safe and getting the politics out of intelligence. I believe there is no place for politics when it comes to protecting our country and our very way of life. It must be USA first. A 3-year extension of these authorities would keep the debate about the Patriot Act out of the heart of the election cycle. I believe including a sunset in the legislation provides the proper checks and balances necessary to ensure we are doing all we can to protect Americans while also protecting Americans' constitutional rights. There will be people in my party who will be on both sides of this issue. Everyone deserves a voice when it comes to national security. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 514.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I would yield 2 minutes to a distinguished military veteran, the gentleman from Illinois.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 514, an extension of these provisions. The most important job of the federal government is to protect our country and to protect its people. My most important job in Congress is to ensure that I am giving the law enforcement community, within the bounds of the Constitution, the tools that they need to make sure that we stay secure, to make sure that we stay protected. That is what I consider the utmost call in members of Congress and the utmost call in members in the military and the law enforcement community. You're going to hear throughout this debate, and you've already heard from so many people that have used these tools in the practice and in implementation and taking out terrorists and taking out organized crime units. Let me just say, I'm an Air Force pilot. I've been overseas and I understand the enemy that we face and the determination that they face to bring what we saw on 9/11, to bring that back to the shores of the United States. I also understand that the only thing standing in between another 9/11 and a peaceful country like we've been feeling for about the last 10 years is our law enforcement community and our United States military. That makes it essential to listen to those individuals and understand what we need to ensure that we're bringing down terrorist cells where they exist in the United States, and we're continuing to protect ourselves from infiltration overseas. On the tragic day on 9/11, Americans were united in their understanding that we must work together as a nation to defeat those who would destroy our way of life. Now it's essential that even though we haven't been attacked, that we understand that sometimes in the quiet lies the biggest threat. And we never forget that this threat is very, very real. So I ask my colleagues to rise and join me. I ask my colleagues to ask themselves, which side do they want to be on? Do they want to be on the side that doesn't necessarily understand and recognize that we're going to continue to be assaulted for generations from a group overseas that wants to destroy and harm our way of life? So I ask for your support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Mrs. Jan Schakowsky, a member of the Intelligence Committee.
Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 514, which reauthorizes and extends provisions in the Patriot Act that I strongly disagree with. I opposed the passage of the Patriot Act in 2001 for the very same reasons that I rise today. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, as a proud member of the Intelligence Committee, I am confident that we can protect our citizens and do it without treading on their rights. Among the provisions extended in this bill is Section 215, which allows the government to gain access to anyone's private, confidential records, including their medical, financial, library, and bookstore records, without first presenting evidence linking those records to a suspected terrorist or spy. It also fails to allow for court oversight of these secret orders and prohibits the recipient of such orders from challenging the legality of the order for a year. You know, I think that the challenge here today is how do we balance the security of our country with protecting the rights of ordinary citizens. I know that we can do better than we do in this legislation, and so I urge each of my colleagues to vote against H.R. 514. Instead, I think we should pass legislation that grants the Intelligence Committee the tools that the intelligence community the tools that it requires while protecting the rights and liberties of all Americans. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I would be pleased to recognize the gentleman from the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Westmoreland, for 2 minutes.
For 2 minutes. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman, the gentleman from Michigan, for allowing me to speak on the extension of this critical bill to our national security. The tragedy of September 11th cast a bright light on our woefully out-of-date intelligence laws. While many of our domestic crime-fighting laws have been made to adapt to the ability of social changes and new technology, our intelligence laws sit on the bookshelf gathering dust for decades. For that reason, I rise today in support of H.R. 514, which will extend 3 expiring provisions of the Patriot Act through December the 8th of 2011. Now, I know I've heard some complaints about civil liberties, but the provisions in this short-term extension are the same tools that have been used by U.S. officials for investigating child molesters, murderers, drug dealers, and other organized crime figures for decades. All this bill does is extend these same tools to intelligence agencies fighting terrorism, and I strongly urge my colleagues to consider that this is a short-term extension to give the Intelligence Committee an opportunity to work on these so that we can get a broad agreement on it. It gives the gentleman from Michigan and the gentleman from Maryland an opportunity to work together, and for all of us to work in a way that will provide the security that all of us want for this nation and still allow us to have all the personal freedoms that we enjoy. And so I just invite and encourage all my friends to vote yes for this simple extension until December, to give us time to do what this country desperately needs for us to do. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Considis.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
It is difficult to debate an issue of such importance and have very good friends who are taking an opposite position. But I think that in this case, we have to look very squarely at the literal reading of the Constitution. The First and Fourth Amendment literal reading makes it very clear that the Patriot Act is a destructive undermining of constitutional principles. There's extraordinary powers being given by the government, and it contravenes not just principles of the Constitution, but our own oath to defend the Constitution. I want to speak to the provisions that are set for reauthorization here. 2 of the provisions are contained in the Patriot Act, legislation that I opposed when it first came up because I believe that it was overt infringement on basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech. The first one, Section 206, known as the John Doe wiretap, allows the FBI to obtain an order from the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to wiretap a target without having to specify the target or the device. And I challenge the constitutionality because I believe this provision severely undermines the Fourth Amendment, which requires warrants to describe the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. This provision of the Patriot Act requires neither the target or device to be identified. The second provision, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, known as the Business Records Provision, allows the FBI to order any person or business to turn over any tangible things as long as it specifies it's for an authorized investigation. Orders executed under Section 215 constitute a serious challenge to the Fourth and First Amendment rights by allowing the government to demand access to records often associated with the exercise of First Amendment rights such as library records or medical records. The third provision, Section 6001, known as the Lone Wolf Surveillance Provision, is contained in the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. It authorized the government to conduct investigations of non-U.S. individuals not connected to a foreign power or terrorist group. It effectively allows the government to circumvent the standards that are required to obtain electronic surveillance orders from criminal courts, and I ask unanimous consent to put extraneous materials in the record in support of it. Thank you.
Without objection. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from Michigan has 4.5 minutes, and the gentleman from Maryland has 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to reserve my time to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, we're going to close. First, it's important we hear all points of view from my colleagues when it comes to the reauthorization of the expiring Patriot Act provisions. I think the 3-year extension outlined in S-289 will take politics out of this debate. I'm pleased that this bill contains a sunset provision. It is important that these authorities have sunset dates so that Congress may evaluate the effectiveness of these tools on an ongoing basis. Only with rigorous oversight can we ensure that the privacy rights of Americans are protected. As ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, I will ensure that the committee conducts effective oversight of these provisions. I hope in subsequent reauthorizations of the Patriot Act that Congress continues to use sunset dates which will keep Congress in the business of oversight on these important authorities. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I would yield myself as much time as I might consume, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, there's, and I appreciate the way the ranking member has approached this issue. There are people who have differences of opinion, strong, passionate opinions on this. I am shocked and a bit amazed at the misinformation that is in and about the Patriot Act. If you believe that roving wiretaps through a court order is bad, then we should stop investigating today organized criminals and drug dealers and child pornographers and kidnappers. If you believe today that going in and trying to get someone's business records to prove that they were at a place with a subpoena from a grand jury is a bad idea, then we should stop doing it. Today you can do it. You can go to the library and get someone's records. As a matter of fact, during the first part of this debate, somebody talked about how they went in and got all these books. So whoever checked out a book on Osama bin Laden and what a horrible thing it was, that wasn't even a FISA warrant. It was a criminal warrant. That happened under the criminal code. That can happen tomorrow. And when this expires at the end of this month, they'll still continue to be able to do that. But you will not be able to go to a FISA court and get a roving wiretap or a court order, by the way, to get records that will help in an ongoing terrorism investigation. It really is mind-boggling. Let me give you the greatest example, I think. The Times Square bomber. If we would have known early in that particular arrangement, they could have gone and figured out, listen, we need a court order. We go to the FISA courts, two courts here, a criminal court and a FISA court. We go to the FISA court because we don't know how big this is. We don't know who's all involved. We don't necessarily want to arrest him. We want to arrest everybody that's involved. So let's go to the judge and prove to the judge that if we can figure out that he bought materials from a hardware store to build a bomb, that we might be able to prevent this thing in the future. So they go, they get a court order, this is hypothetical, and they get a court order, which is a pretty high standard in any investigation. Or the other option is the bomb goes off, it kills hundreds, if not thousands of people, and that very same FBI agent takes it with a criminal warrant and gets the very same information after the bomb has gone off. That's what we're talking about. That's the difference. This notion that somehow you don't have to go to a court to get this, to get an order is wrong. Trust me, you're not going to be able to go through somebody's underwear drawer because you want to. It's not going to happen. If you believe in the process that we have in our criminal courts to have to go and get an order by a third-party adjudicator, then you should also believe that this is a really good idea to be able to do it in these broad, hard-to-do investigations into terrorism and spying. It's difficult. Remember the Russian spy ring that was just broken up recently? They had a FISA, a court order warrant for a very long time, because they needed to figure out everything that was going on before they brought this thing to a head. The same with the terrorism investigation. Think about how global it is now. They planned the attacks in Afghanistan to attack New York. And it went through Pakistan and other places and Saudi Arabia. And they had multiple states involved when they brought this plot together. It's big. It's complicated. To take away at the end of this month our ability to get a roving wiretap that, by the way, on the very next day after you stop our ability to go to a FISA court to get one, you can still get one in a criminal case against an organized crime or a drug dealer here in the United States. Why? Why would we do that to ourselves, Mr. Speaker? It makes no sense. And the work that goes into putting these things together for the brief to go to the court is significant. And I will tell you right now, there are very brave Americans who are working cases right now, hoping to get their brief done so they can walk into a judge and get an order that might pertain to business records, or it might be a roving wiretap to keep America safe. If it expires, they won't be able to do it. There is no difference. As a matter of fact, the standard in the FISA court is higher. Mr. Speaker, I would strongly urge this body's support of what we know is working and has kept America safe since its inception, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, since its enactment in 2001, the Patriot Act has been the object of so many false allegations and exaggerations that the myths have overshadowed the truth. It's time to dispel the myths once and for all. Let's begin with the myth that national security officials do not need these provisions to protect us from terrorist attacks. This is demonstrably untrue. Numerous terrorist attempts in the last 10 years have been thwarted thanks to the intelligence gathering tools provided in the Patriot Act and other national security laws. And if Congress fails to extend these provisions, set to expire on February 28th, it will be on our shoulders if the intelligence needed to stop the next attack is not collected. Opponents claim that these expiring provisions of the Patriot Act violate the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. This, too, is false. Each of the provisions at issue amends the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. Enacted in 1978, FISA sets forth specific intelligence-gathering procedures that do comply with constitutional protections and have been consistently upheld by the courts. Let's also dispel the myth that these provisions grant broad-sweeping, unchecked authority for the government to collect information on innocent Americans. Again, this is absolutely untrue. These types of provisions have been used by domestic law enforcement agencies for years to apprehend typical criminals. Roving wiretaps are nothing new. Domestic law enforcement agencies have had roving authority for criminal investigations since 1986. And Section 215 business records have more strict requirements than the grand jury subpoenas used in criminal investigations. It makes no sense to let law enforcement officials use a tool to investigate a drug dealer, but then deny that same authority to intelligence officials investigating terrorists. And contrary to claims by critics, there is oversight of these provisions. Both Section 206 roving wiretaps and Section 215 business records requests must be approved by a FISA judge. Both Section 206 roving wiretaps and Section 215 business records also are subject to rigorous minimization procedures. These procedures, also approved by a FISA judge, ensure that only information that pertains to the investigation is actually collected. Finally, both Section 206 roving wiretaps and Section 215 business records prohibit the government from gathering intelligence on a U.S. citizen or legal resident who are exercising their First Amendment rights. The third provision set to expire is the so-called lone wolf definition. As originally enacted, FISA authorized intelligence gathering only on foreign governments, terrorist groups, or their agents. FISA did not allow the government to collect intelligence against individual terrorists. The lone wolf provision amended the definition of agent of a foreign power to close this gap. An increasing number of attempted terrorist attacks on the U.S. are being carried out by self-radicalized jihadists who adopt an agenda as equally hateful and destructive as any terrorist group. The lone wolf definition simply brings our national security laws into the 21st century to allow our intelligence officials to respond to the modern-day terrorist threat. The lone wolf authority cannot be used against a U.S. citizen. This temporary extension ensures that there are no gaps in our intelligence collection. Without an extension of these authorities, we will forfeit our ability to prevent terrorist attacks. A temporary extension of these provisions is the only way to provide House members the time to study the law, hold hearings, consider amendments, and conduct markups. We need to approve this temporary extension today, or we will make it harder to prevent terrorist attacks. Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The distinguished gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we go again. Last Tuesday on February 8th, when this measure came up, it was defeated. It was a bipartisan vote. There was a full and fair discussion. 26 members on the other side joined with us to make sure that this measure was adequately examined for the flaws. It's not that the Patriot Act isn't important or needed, it's just that it's flawed. And the most flawed provision is the one I want to comment on briefly of the three provisions, and that is the so-called lone wolf provision, someone operating on his own, not particularly attached to anyone. This provision allows our full national security surveillance powers, which are designed to be used against enemy governments, to be used against a single individual who is unaffiliated with any foreign power or terrorist group. Now, it is widely known that this provision has never been used. It hasn't been used because there are no terrorists. It hasn't been used because it doesn't have to be used. The Department of Justice, by its own admission, has other powers to go after these individuals. And that's why it hasn't been used. And because we got a closed rule from the Rules Committee, we weren't able to work out an agreement to take it out. And so therefore, I come before you today to urge that we do not accept this measure. It is way too broad, and under the statutory definition, virtually any evildoer can be declared a lone wolf. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's be tough on terrorists, but let's describe this in a way that will not be used in a way that will create fears that if we drop the lone wolf provision, the world may come to an end. I urge that this one provision is sufficient reason for us not to agree to the measure before us today, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, who is the chairman of the Crime and Terrorism Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Judiciary Chairman for yielding. Last week, 122 Democrats rejected legislation to temporarily extend the 3 expiring Patriot Act provisions, including 36 who supported a 1-year extension last year. The House then adopted a rule to bring the bill back to the floor today, and the vast majority of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle opposed that too. These votes are nothing but the minority party playing politics with national security, and their arguments ring hollow. The Democrats' 1-year extension last February successfully achieved their goal of delaying Patriot reauthorization until after the midterm elections, but it left very little time for the new Congress to complete a reauthorization bill before the February 28th sunset. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle now profess concerns with the expiring provisions. If they were so concerned about the law, they could have easily brought a reauthorization bill to the floor last Congress, making changes to these provisions, but they did not. They also take issue with the process used to achieve this much-needed extension, criticizing the absence of hearings or a markup. But they gloss over the fact that their 1-year extension was brought straight to the floor with no hearing, no markup, and no opportunity to offer amendments. The same circumstances that a year ago they now claim to dislike. Since this law was enacted, these provisions have been scrutinized to the fullest extent of the law and have either been unchallenged or found constitutional. The lone wolf definition has never been challenged. Section 206 roving wiretaps have never been challenged. But members should know that in 1992, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's the Ninth Circuit, the most liberal in the country, upheld criminal roving wiretap authority under the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. Section 215's business records were challenged, but after Congress made changes to that provision in the 2006 reauthorization, which I sponsored, the lawsuit was withdrawn. These three provisions have stopped countless potential attacks and play a critical role in helping ensure law enforcement officials have the tools they need to keep our country and its people safe. Opponents of these provisions argue that we can simply use criminal laws to gather the information we need. But this argument ignores the most important distinction between criminal investigations and intelligence gathering. Criminal investigations only occur after the fact, after a murder has been committed or a home has been burglarized. The entire purpose of intelligence gathering is prevention, to stop the terrorist attack before it happens. We cannot rely on criminal tools to identify and apprehend those who are plotting to attack us. As the Democrats choose to play politics rather than worry about the safety of our country, we're now under a time crunch. Only 4 legislative days, including today, remain for the House to extend these provisions before they expire and our nation is placed at a greater security risk. We can't let our guard down. These are needed provisions to keep America safe, and I urge the House to approve this bill today and urge the other body to act quickly to reauthorize these provisions. Now is the time to put politics aside and do what's right for America's national security. I urge passage of the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I'd like to remind the Chairman Emeritus of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Sensenbrenner, that we are not playing politics, and merely accusing us of that and of not having hearings doesn't help the debate much. Now, on September the 22nd, 2009, the Subcommittee on the Constitution of the Judiciary Committee held hearings. And on October the 29th, 2009, the full committee held hearings and reported out a bill, I would say to my friend from Wisconsin. And on November 4th and 5th of 2009, I say to the distinguished gentleman, we had a 2-day markup in Judiciary with record votes on 10 amendments offered by members of both parties. And we reported out a compromise measure by voice vote. And so to say that we didn't hold hearings when we were in control is inaccurate, and I am not made happy by this misrepresentation. Now, to say that this is a minority party tactic misses the point again. The gentleman was awake and on the floor last Tuesday. 26 of your members voted with us. That's not partisan politics. And so I'm sorry, I am very sorry that this discussion is getting off with so much misinformation, but I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, Chairman of the House Administration Committee and a senior member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, let's be reminded of what the 9/11 Commission report observed. That report said the choice between security and liberty is a false choice, as nothing is more likely to endanger America's liberties than the success of a terrorist attack at home. In this case, freedom presupposes security. That's what we're talking about here. The distinguished former chairman of the Judiciary Committee basically has called into question the lone wolf terrorist provision. He says it's never been used. I heard this same argument on the floor last year before we had the domestic lone wolf known as Major Hassan. I heard the same argument on this floor last year before we saw the consequence of a lone wolf action in Times Square. I heard the same argument last year before we saw the lone wolf action of the Christmas Day bomber. I heard the same arguments 2 years ago before we heard that. The fact of the matter is, the greater concern that we have today, as expressed just this last week by the Secretary of Homeland Security, that the level of the threat is as high today as it has ever been since 9/11. And when asked about it, she explained, as did the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, that it is the less consequential attacks done by those who are not directly associated with al-Qaeda or affiliate organizations, i.e. lone wolves, that cause us to be of a greater concern today. CIA Director Leon Panetta of this administration has warned that it's the lone wolf strategy that I think we have to pay attention to as the main threat to this country. And the gentleman from Michigan would have us wait until that threat is carried out before we then say, well, maybe now we have a reason to have the lone wolf provision. Professor Robert Turner of the Center for National Security Law has written of how the absence of authority to conduct surveillance of a lone wolf terrorist undermined the FBI's effort to gain access to the content of Zacarias Moussaoui's laptop computer and materially impeded a critically important investigation that, in the absence of FISA, might well have helped prevent the attacks on September 11, 2001. Now, the distinguished former chairman of the committee has said this allows us to use this provision against anybody. Not true. It has to be someone who is not a citizen or a permanent resident of the United States, who is engaged in international terrorism but may not be linked to a foreign power or terrorist organization. Today, in the age of the Internet, when someone is incited or inspired by one of these individuals from a foreign country and then carries out a terrorist act, that is the definition of a lone wolf. And the gentleman from Michigan would have us shackle ourselves not to be able to deal with this. As was explained by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers, a former agent of the FBI, these are anti-terrorism cases, not criminal investigations. And what we're trying to do is not collect the body parts after a successful attack and then try and find those who caused it and try and bring them to justice. No, we're trying to stop the attack in the first place, protect Americans. That's why you have the FISA court. That's why you have some of these different definitions. But what we have done within the ambit of those definitions is try and protect the civil liberties of Americans while at the same time allowing us to take reasonable, responsible, and yes, proactive actions against those who would murder Americans. There is a difference between a criminal investigation and a counterterrorism effort. It is the difference between trying to prosecute someone for a crime that has already been committed as opposed to trying to prevent the death and destruction that would be rained upon the United States by these terrorists. I am the author of the sunset provisions. I brought this because I thought it required us to look at these three provisions because, yes, they were the most controversial. But I am convinced, after looking at it in these years, that these provisions have not been abused. But at the same time, I'm going to be working with the gentleman from Wisconsin and others to have rapid, intensive, active oversight of these provisions to ensure that we do not have some deprivation of civil liberties as we carry out these necessary functions.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 15 seconds to
Gentleman
remind my dear friend from California that the provisions in Lone Wolf do not apply to Americans. Hassan was an American, and we have not yet
Your time is
used I yield myself 15 seconds more.
Gentleman recognized.
And we have not yet used the terrorist provisions of Lone Wolf. And I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, 45 seconds.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 45 seconds.
And I would hope that my good friend from California, in his very passionate defense of the Patriot Act, did not mean to imply that the distinguished Mr. Conyers in some way would suborn terrorism, because he chooses to point out that the standards that are required to obtain electronic surveillance orders from criminal courts are really being circumvented under Section 601. I'll yield.
I did not question the motivation of the gentleman from Michigan,
okay,
nor would I, but I would question his conclusions and the impact of his decision.
I think it's fair for us to debate this. I think we have to be just cautious about how far we draw conclusions about the motivations of each other in taking the positions that we do. I yield back.
I'm pleased now to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Walter Jones, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And it's always interesting for those of us who don't have a law degree to come down and listen, and sometimes, like myself today, to have a few minutes to share my thoughts on this, because I think the majority of people in my district are God-fearing, constitutional-loving Americans like anybody else's district and people across this nation. I regret and will always regret that I was too weak to vote my conscience when we had the Patriot Act up the first time. I did not feel good as a non-attorney, but an American who loves the Constitution and believes in the civil liberties that are guaranteed, that this country for too many times has sold itself to the federal government to take care of it. And I make reference, Mr. Speaker, to a book that was written by Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's a well-known constitutional lawyer who's on Fox News from time to time. The title of the book is A Nation of Sheep. He actually wrote this book in 2007, years after we passed the Patriot Act. And he goes through every aspect of the Patriot Act that he believes sincerely is a serious violation of the civil liberties of the American people. And in fact, I would like to share just a couple of his comments. He said that the gravest dangers to our freedoms lie hidden in a government that has seized them from us, and that vigilance and natural law can save us from the power-hungry bureaucrats who run the government today. He further stated in the book, A Nation of Sheep, an unalienable right comes from God and is an element of humanity that cannot be given up or legislated away. Let us not legislate our God-given right to liberty. And, Mr. Speaker, I hope that my colleagues who voted against this when it was on suspension will again today vote no on this reauthorization, because it should go to a hearing. It should be very careful, and I hope and pray that maybe we will be able to defeat this tonight. I know the odds are against that. But, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back, and I will ask God to continue to bless America and bless the Constitution. And as the Napolitano says, let's not be a nation of sheep. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I would now like to recognize a senior member of the committee, Bobby Scott, former chairman of the Subcommittee on Crime and Judiciary, as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in opposition to H.R. 514, which would extend for 1 year sweeping governmental intrusions into our lives and privacy that were authorized by the USA Patriot Act and the 2004 Intelligence Act. Without meaningful oversight and committee deliberations demonstrating that these extraordinary powers are needed, we should not extend these provisions for 1 full year, or any period of time for that matter, and I therefore oppose the bill. I'm opposed because I simply do not accept the argument that in order to be safe, we necessarily have to sacrifice our rights and freedoms. I agree with Benjamin Franklin, who stated during the formation of our nation that they who give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. One of the provisions the bill reauthorizes is Section 215 of the Patriot Act that gives the government power to secretly invade our private records, such as books we read at the library, by merely alleging that they are relevant to a terrorism investigation, but without having to show that the seized material is in connection with any specific no requirement to show probable cause or even reasonable suspicion of being related to a specific act of terrorism, and therefore there is no meaningful standard to judge whether or not the material is in fact necessary. Another provision of H.R. 514 is Section 206 of the Patriot Act, which is referred to as the roving John Doe wiretap provision. It gives the government the power to wiretap a phone conversation without having to show which phone will be tapped or even who will be using it, and without requiring a court order for a specific roving tap. The third provision is Section 6001 of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, referred to as the Lone Wolf provision. It gives the government the power to spy on individuals in the United States who are not U.S. citizens or permanent resident aliens, even though they are not agents of foreign government or any terrorist organization. Unfortunately, this means that if those targeted have any interaction with an American citizen, then that American citizen is spied upon as well. We have already allowed spying on such non-citizens outside of the United States, or even in the United States where there is probable cause, only that they are agents of a foreign government or members of a terrorist organization, but there is an extension of that power which could envelop anybody simply as a result of the occasion of interacting with the targeted person, even while in the United States. The three provisions give the government power to invade our privacy even when there is no probable cause, nor even reasonable suspicion or credible evidence of any wrongdoing, and without allowing the kind of detached oversight, such as a court warrant, which is generally called upon when such power over individuals is extended. And it is important to note that in cases of emergencies, warrants can be obtained after the fact. Law enforcement officials can perform wiretaps and searches in emergency situations and then get a warrant. So, Mr. Speaker, absent oversight protections, and even when after-the-fact warrants are available, all three of these provisions should be allowed to expire unless we demonstrate in oversight hearings and committee deliberations that these powers are necessary and narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling national security interest. These freedoms and protections that these provisions take away are the very core of our values and liberties, so these protections should not be legislated away without committee deliberations guaranteeing vigorous oversight to protect against abuse. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren.
Thank the gentleman for yielding the 2 minutes. And what I'd just like to say, Mr. Speaker, is that with respect to roving wiretaps, it's only available after the government has been able to prove to the court that the target may engage in counter-surveillance activity, such as rapidly changing the cell phone number. It doesn't allow the government to make a general boilerplate application. It requires them, if they can't identify the individual, the very specific individual, to describe, to give some particularity in the request to identify that person as much as they possibly can. It is also a requirement that we put in the law that once they have actually utilized this roving wiretap on different instruments of communication, they have to report to the court within 10 days as to what took place. So we have refined this as much as absolutely possible. What we're trying to do is keep up with technology. We know that some of these targets will buy 100 cell phones and use them for a single conversation and throw that cell phone away. You can't just think that's going to happen. You have to prove to the satisfaction of the court that there is a reason to believe that they are going to take these kinds of efforts to try and stop surveillance in these regards. And again, this is before the FISA court, and it only deals with these kinds of cases. This is not regular criminal cases. So the gentleman's concerns, having been raised, have been raised before, and we met those concerns in our prior treatment of this law. So it is a careful balance that we have created here. to take into consideration the new techniques utilized by those who would threaten us, and at the same time try and provide for a third party, a court, a federal court made of federal judges, to look at this. We have to report before, and we would have to, that is, our agency activists would have to report afterwards within 10 days. I believe that's about as much protection as you can give and still be effective in this environment.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased now to recognize distinguished member of this body, Dana Rohrabacher of California, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when Congress passed the Patriot Act in 2001 in the aftermath of 9/11, we mandated sunsets on the provisions that dramatically expanded federal investigative and enforcement powers, especially those that could infringe on the freedom of American citizens. Sunsets meant that Congress would have to specifically extend the time on those powers or they would expire. 5 years ago, the last time around, the Bush administration attempted to make permanent these crisis-related expansions of authority by removing the sunsets. Now, let me congratulate my friend from California who spent so much time trying to make sure the sunsets were in. And Dan, we know that you worked really hard to make sure those sunsets were put in, but not all of them were. This power grab on the part of the Bush administration was thwarted by good members like Dan Lundgren, who are with us today in this debate. Today, a few controversial sections still are scheduled to periodically sunset. The congressional action to extend these provisions deserves hearings, adequate debate, the right to amend, and thus ensuring accountability and transparency on such a significant issue. We have not met this standard this time around. The Republican leadership has committed to a more acceptable process by December when the extension of this bill comes up for a vote again. I hope I will be able to vote yes at that time. Until then, it is no. And let us note about the accusations of politics in this. I believe the American people have a legitimate fear of out-of-control government. They have a legitimate fear of out-of-control spending and out-of-control bureaucracy. And yes, they have a legitimate fear of out-of-control prosecutors and out-of-control spy networks. Let's make sure we stand for freedom here. That's not political.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Simpson.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I want to give my friend from California and other members a little history lesson. When the Patriot Act was drafted in 2001, I insisted on the sunset, and the then Republican-controlled House prevailed on that issue against the then Democrat-controlled Senate. I resisted repeal of the sunset prematurely, and in 2005, the Judiciary Committee, when I was chairman, had hearings on each of the 17 provisions. There was no controversy about 14 of those provisions. Even the ACLU testified in behalf that those provisions had not been abused. So 14 of the provisions were made permanent. This law has not trampled on anybody's civil rights. Where there was a constitutional problem with Section 215, it was fixed in the reauthorization. And I'm getting a little bit irritated at the scaremongering that has been going on about this law when no provision has been held unconstitutional by a court.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased now to recognize Jerry Nadler, former chair of the Constitutional Subcommittee, for as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the extension of these provisions. When the House has done nothing to consider them or to consider possible reforms, or even to hold a hearing or a markup. The 3 sections scheduled to sunset are all troubling, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to review them carefully before they come before the House again. Section 215 authorizes the government to obtain any tangible things such as library or business or medical records if there are reasonable grounds to believe that they are relevant to a foreign intelligence or international terrorism investigation. Before the enactment of Section 215, the government had to show specific and articulable facts giving reason to believe that the person to whom the records pertain is a foreign agent or a terrorist. Section 215 allows the government to delve into the personal records of someone even if there is no reason to believe that that person has anything to do with a terrorism or with potential terrorism. This poses a threat to individual rights in the most sensitive areas of our lives with little restraint on the government. Section 206 provides for roving wiretap orders that supposedly to catch up with technology, but these orders identify neither the person to be tapped nor the facility to be tapped. This is, for all practical purposes, a general grant of authority to wiretap anyone, anywhere, that the government wants. They should either have to identify either the person or, because of modern technology, the facility, but one or the other. There are almost no limits to this authority and no requirement that the government name a specific target. This is akin, very similar, to the British general writs of assistance which engendered the first colonial outrage that led to the American Revolution. Here we are, coming full circle. Section 6001 of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, the so-called lone wolf provision, permits secret intelligence surveillance of people who are conceitedly not affiliated with a foreign government or organization. It provides the government with the ability to use secret courts and other investigative tools that are unacceptable in a domestic criminal investigation as if we were dealing with a foreign government or entity. According to government testimony, this provision has never been used because you can use the normal criminal provisions if you suspect someone of planning mayhem or terrorism or anything else. Surveillance of an individual who is not working with a foreign government or organization is not what we normally consider or understand as foreign intelligence. There may be good reasons for the government to keep tabs on such people, but that is no reason to suspend all our laws under the pretext that it is a foreign intelligence operation. While some have argued that each of these authorities remain necessary tools in the fight against terrorism, I believe we should not miss the opportunity to review the Patriot Act in its entirety, including the 14 sections that were sunsetted that are now permanent, that many of us opposed making permanent at the time, thought they should continue to be sunsetted so we could review from time to time. We should examine the Act to see how it's working, where it's been successful, where it's failed, where it goes too far, and where it poses threats to our liberties. That's the purpose of sunsets, and to extend the sunsets without review undermines that purpose. There's another law that's allied to this that also deserves careful review. The National Securities Letters Act. I have introduced legislation which would better protect civil liberties while ensuring that NSLs remain a useful tool in national security investigations. I hope we can work to strike that balance in a responsible and effective manner, but the record of the abuse of the NSL authority is too great for the Congress to ignore. I was encouraged to see some of my Republican colleagues cross the aisle last week to vote no on the extension. It shows a healthy skepticism of unrestrained government power to spy on people in the United States. That is the essence of opposition to unchecked government power. That value should not be a partisan one. I hope to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to restore our traditional respect for the right of people to be secure from unchecked government intrusion. That's why we have the Fourth Amendment. I hope we will be able, after this vote, to examine carefully the way these provisions have been used or abused and to look at ways to reform the law in light of experience. That was the purpose of sunsets, and I hope we can take advantage of that opportunity. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.